Neil, I found out about your work by literally through a Lex Friedman podcast. And I was like, wait, he's tackling kind of what we're into, but from a different lens. You've not only been really influential in the Fab Lab movement, but really across the board in getting smaller and smaller and more precise and automated manufacturing happen. So we're really, really excited for your talk. Thank you so much. Also, maybe you want to explain to us how Eric accused you of cheating. That would be incredible. All right, please take it away. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Allison. Yeah, years ago, Eric Drexler accused me of cheating, of doing atomically precise manufacturing long before it was due by redefining the atom, which I'll explain. And Allison also reminded me, I spoke to this a long time ago, so I'm happy to be back. So at a TED Talk, I said computer science was the worst thing to happen to computers or to science because it's unphysical. It created an artificial barrier that I never understood, which is why I created Center for Bits and Atoms with colleagues. So we did the first quantum computation. We introduced cryptography and materials. We were part of starting Internet of Things. We did the microfluidics for genome transplantation for the minimal synthetic cell. All these projects at the boundary of digital and physical where you can't tell them apart. And probably the most important insight from it is this. It appears there was an AI explosion, but what really happened is 2 years ago, degrees of freedom in a large computer matched degrees of freedom in a brain. So we'd be derelict if the computer couldn't do what the brain did. That's the real scaling. But if you look at the degrees of freedom and the performance, they matched as of 2 years ago. If you look at the chip fab making the computer, it's placing about 10 to the 10 parts per second. You sitting here digesting your breakfast are placing 10 to the 18 parts per second. There's 8 orders of magnitude in fabricational complexity between biology and a chip fab. 8 orders of magnitude isn't a prefactor, it's a cosmological difference in the ability to place things. And so what I want to talk about is how my lab is trying to fill in those 8 orders of magnitude. So 1952, MIT made the first real-time computer and the first numerically controlled milling machine. A lab like mine at MIT has millions of dollars of machines that are successors to that. We can make almost anything, but they're hard to get access to, hard to use. The Whirlwind was commercialized as the PDP. If you use iOS or Android, it happened in that picture. That's Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie inventing Unix on the PDP, which was the transistorized Whirlwind. Accidentally, for the NSF, I started Fab Labs for outreach, which were mini versions of my lab along the way for the research roadmap. And so it's 3D printing, but everything else you need around that to make complete functional systems. They went viral. They're doubling every year and a half. Today, there's 3,000 in 150 countries. There's legislation in the House and Senate to view it as a new kind of right. We're working with a number of cities on cities being able to produce what they consume sustainably, democratizing the means of production. There's a really interesting project to organize this in the Bay Area. If you're interested, I can tell you about. The mini computers were commercialized as hobbyist computers. The analogy there is we've been developing faster, better, cheaper machines to make things. So we started, for example, Form Labs that's up to 1,000 employees, about 10 companies that make machines that make things. But that's not what I'm really interested in. My real interest is in rapid prototyping of rapid prototyping. So we're reinventing how CAD, CAM, machine control, and motion control works to redo the foundations of how you build machines, teaching people to do machine building. This is a project recently with NIST to make a 3D printer that does rheology, so it learns to print recycled and renewable materials by not sending a file to it, but by closing a high-level control loop where the machine learns to understand the materials and adapt to sustainable materials. So rapid prototyping of rapid prototyping. So scaling in these numbers, 1 Earth, 1,000 cities, 1 million towns, 1 billion people, that's the PC era. The analogy there is Form Labs was spun off from my lab, but I don't like 3D printing because it's analog. The essence Shannon and von Neumann taught us is something biology discovered 4 billion years ago, the evolutionary age of the ribosome, of the role of detecting and correcting errors with information in the system and hierarchical complexity with geometry defined by the parts. biology understands that, 3D printers don't understand that. So my lab has been working on assemblers. On large scales, we made the world's highest performance ultralight material by linking loops of carbon fiber. With NASA, this is the size of Langley's biggest wind tunnel. It's a completely morphing airframe, much more efficient. We have a proposal with NASA to make a 100-meter space telescope with these little mobile, instead of unfolding a giant telescope, working with the chief scientist of the Webb telescope to have swarms of robots assembling little building blocks to make giant structures. And then on smaller scales, we're making micro assemblers that build micromechanical things, 3D electronics. Related to this, we have a project with ARIA to make machine learning systems that can learn to build their own construction. Instead of the architecture being static, they can learn to build how they build themselves. Finally, up to the equivalent to the IoT era, ribosomes are slow. You build an elephant a molecule per second at 1 hertz, but ribosomes are fast because ribosomes make ribosomes. So a cell can have a trillion when you add them up. And so the essence of scaling those 8 orders of magnitude in fabricational complexity is the ability to self-assemble, massively parallel serial fabrication with assemblers making assemblers. So on large scale, these are robots making robots with functional voxels out of the places they're assembling. I mentioned we're looking at doing that with the Webb telescope. Start with a successor to the Webb telescope to flat pack 100-meter space telescope that unfolds itself. We're looking at doing it for space settlements. We're working with the auto industry, ship company. Interesting discussion of using these to build a mindfulness city with Bhutan out of sustainable biomaterials. On smaller scales, we're making micro robots that recursively make micro robots for microassembly. And then we're grateful for support from Schmidt to look at when Lego becomes quantum. So these are nanoclusters. And so we work in molecular biology, like the work I described on synthetic organism and mycoplasma. I work on micro to nano assembly, and there's a really interesting crossover between a mechanical joint and a chemical bond. And so in here, what we're looking at is we're making nanoclusters that were programmatically assembled to make micro machines to make self-reproducing systems. So stepping back, I complained about computer science, but the founders of computer science understood that, even though it's largely forgotten. What von Neumann's report on the EDVAC is dreadful. The last thing he wrote is beautiful. It's self-reproducing automata, how a computation communicates its own construction. Turing ended up with literally the mother of all AI problems, which is morphogenesis, how genes give rise to form. It's beautiful how that's implemented. There's a lot, talk to me about afterwards about how that's implemented. So the founders of computer science ended their life studying the embodiment of computation. That got dissected from history. To close those 8 orders of magnitude, you need to merge communication and computation with fabrication, with a computation that can communicate its own construction. So I talk about all of these here. I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Okay, well.
Hey there. Maybe you get this all the time, but have you given any thought to how all of this is either related to AI, like HiveMind AI, and also the work out of Michael Levin's lab?
So let's see, the relationship to AI, I mentioned in 2 ways. To recap, one is AI is great. It sits on NVIDIA GPUs in the cloud. The architecture has nothing to do with the computation, roughly. So one of our ARIA projects is making physically reconfigurable computing systems so AI systems can learn their own architecture. One of the reasons we're doing that is we're making zeptojoule electronics. So milli, micro, nano, pico, femto, atto, zepto is electronics that runs at 10 to the minus 21 joules, and learning to use that to reduce AI power consumption by orders of magnitude. That's the straightforward answer. The deeper answer is morphogenesis, systems that learn to build themselves, is the most profound AI system of all. For me, it's not the brain, it's the Hox genes that lie behind evolution, and that's what we're really implementing. And let me also really quickly ask myself a question that you may be thinking, which is, when I talk about this, people clap and say, oh, that sounds really exciting. And then my younger brother led the biggest video game studio at Activision. My older brother led the National Labor Relations Organization, and they would be in the back groaning. because I'm being naive about how technology comes into society. Who gets access? What are the barriers to access? And how do we prevent spam and fake news and income inequality of self-reproducing assemblers? And so the reason we wrote this book is to look at, I described this 50-year roadmap for replicators, but then they're looking at how do we shape it today rather than letting it go off the rails.
Thank you. Also, by the way, many of my community co-inhabitants were just in the Mindfulness City in Bhutan, and it's looking pretty good already.
Good.
All right. Thank you so much, Neil.
Thank you.